All right, thank you so much, Anna, for that really nice introduction to the ORKG, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that I've done through this ORKG curation grant. My name is Lauren Snyder. I am an agroecologist and food system scientist. Currently, I work as a science communication assistant at the Institute of Geobotany at Leibniz University in Hanover, and I'm also a freelance science communicator and writer. And today I'm really excited to share my latest curation in the ORKG platform, looking at the importance of biodiversity in agricultural systems, specifically the effect of legume intercrops in cereal crop yield in European agroecosystems. Let's see if we can. Okay, so to orient you, I'll first start by providing some background information to set the stage for my research question. And then I will present my ORKG comparison in the platform and highlight some of the methods that I use to identify the scientific literature and highlight some of the key pieces of literature that I included in the comparison. And I will also share a visualization that I created in the ORKG platform that summarizes some of the findings from my research topic. And then I will conclude by not just related to my research topic, but also share some of my experiences working in the ORKG platform. So to begin by giving you a little information about agrobiodiversity, I think it's important to first define what do we mean by this term. So in general, agrobiodiversity refers to all of the plants and animals that are associated with an agricultural system. And for this research topic, I will be focusing on plant diversity specifically. And there's a lot of evidence that plant diversity can provide a number of ecosystem services that ultimately support crop yield. So for example, by enhancing plant diversity, we can also potentially enhance pollination services. We can increase soil fertility, which can ultimately support crop yields, and we can even suppress insect pests that cause crop damage. And in turn, these ecosystem services can provide economic and nutritional benefits that ultimately support farmer livelihoods and food security. So now that we understand why plant diversity can be important for so many reasons, the challenge becomes how do we best incorporate this diversity into a farm? And one way to do this is to grow legumes alongside other crop species. So I realize this next slide may be a little cruel for those of us who are approaching lunchtime, but we're actually all probably familiar with legumes. So for example, the beans in this amazing looking taco or the lentils in the soup. We know that they're very nutritious for us, but they also have the potential to provide benefits for ecosystems and potentially even agricultural ecosystems. And you're also welcome for the lunch suggestions. So there's your inspiration. And the reason that legumes can be so important in these systems is because they can help make nitrogen available to other plants. And the reason that this is important is because nitrogen is a limiting nutrient for plants. That means it's hard for them to come by. And that's because most nitrogen is in the atmosphere in a form that plants cannot use. But legumes are a special type of plant that form relationships with bacteria in the soil that help to take nitrogen from the atmosphere, put it in the soil in a form that's available to other plants. And this is important because if we can leverage legumes to provide these nutritional benefits to other plants, we could potentially reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilizers that are not only harmful for the environment, but also are expensive for farmers to use. So one way that we can potentially take advantage of legumes is to grow them in an intercrop with other crop species. So for example, you could start with your original crop. Just as an example here, I'm showing wheat, and then you would plant a legume alongside the wheat crop in the same field simultaneously. And so in this way, potentially the legumes could provide nitrogen to the wheat. And this sounds like a great system because by having more access to nitrogen, you would potentially have a higher wheat yield. But we also know that by planting multiple crop species together, we can facilitate competitive interactions that would actually reduce the yield of the wheat. And so what we need to do is determine how these potential synergies or trade-offs actually play out in real-world agricultural systems. And so this is exactly what I wanted to do with my comparison in the ORKG, was to explore how do legume crops increase or not cereal crop yields. And I did this by looking at studies that compared cereal grain yield in intercropping systems with legumes to monocultures where the cereal crop was grown by itself. And for this comparison, I focused on research done in Europe just to make the comparison more manageable. So to identify the papers to be included in the comparison, I conducted a literature search in the Web of Science, and this yielded 34 potential papers, 4 of which met my eligibility criteria, which are described in more detail in the comparison. But I do want to just take a moment to highlight one of the key reasons I had to exclude papers. And this was because if a paper included quantitative data in a figure, it's hard to precisely extract that information. And for the purpose of these curation grants, our goal was to really pull data as it was reported exactly in a paper. So I was limited to using data presented in a tabular format. And I want to highlight this information because I think it underscores the importance of producing or publishing scientific literature in a machine-actionable format from the outset. And I think this is one of the visions of the ORKG team, so I wanted to just highlight the importance of that here. So now that you have a little bit of background about my research question and how I found the literature to be included in comparison, I'll just take a moment to show you the comparison in the platform itself. All right, so here we have the comparison, and I always started a comparison by providing a short description so that somebody outside of my research field could understand the relevance of the research topic and become familiar with some of the terms that might be used. And I always also described how I conducted the literature search so that it could be reproduced by somebody else. So if we scroll down here, we can see this gray column on the left is labeled properties. And this just refers to different types of information or characteristics associated with the data in these publications. So for example, what was the research problem that the authors were addressing? How did they set up their experiments? What statistical tests did they use to report their information? And then along here, we can see the different contributions that are included. And I want to make an important distinction because you may remember I mentioned that I had 4 eligible papers, but I actually have 18 contributions or study observations. And that's because each paper had multiple study observations that could be included here. And so you can see that the digitized and highly structured nature of this comparison is what facilitates knowledge transfer across disciplines. And this can make it really easy for somebody to quickly harvest data from multiple papers and conduct a larger scale analysis. And for me, this comparison provides a condensed overview of the state of knowledge in my research field in this tabular format. So just as an example, I'm particularly interested in the crop yield of these controls or the monocultures compared to the treatment where we have legume intercrops. So if we click here, I can get more information about the crop yield of the control. And we can see it has a quality, which is crop grain yield. And this is important because, as Anna was explaining, this is how we can link data across different comparisons and collate it into a larger data set. So if another researcher was also reporting information on crop grain yield, we could look at that across studies. And if I click here, then we have further information about this field. So there's a measurement value. It has a unit. We can see something about the number of replicates. And in this instance, the authors did not report any standard error, which we may want to know. And then we could also compare this to the treatment. So again, it has the same quality of crop grain yield, but it has a different numeric value associated with it. And this is what helps to make the data not only human readable, but also machine readable. And another way that we can look at this data in a way that is easier for us to kind of synthesize the outcomes is in the form of a visualization or a figure, which I also created in the ORKG platform. Let me just share again my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, hopefully you can see the presentation again.
Yes.
Fantastic. Let's move this. So before showing the visualization, I just briefly remind you of the research question we're looking at, and that is whether or not legume intercrops provide a benefit in terms of cereal crop yields. And so to look at the visualization that addresses this question, here on the y-axis, I have grain yield reported as kilograms per hectare. And along the x-axis, we have the 18 different study observations or contributions that I showed you in the comparison just now. And then a star represents a statistical difference between the monoculture yield represented in blue and the intercrop yield represented in red. So if we look at this just briefly, we can see that in most instances, there was no significant difference in the yield of the monocultures compared to the legume intercrops. So this suggests that maybe in most instances we could implement legume intercrops without sacrificing yield. However, there are 3 instances where there was a yield loss when we incorporated the legume intercrops. And so this suggests that there's further research that needs to be done so that we can improve these systems and exploit the other benefits of legumes, such as soil fertility or perhaps weed suppression, without sacrificing yield. And I think the visualization is also another example of the power of the ORKG platform because it provides this overall trend of the state of knowledge in this research field and allows us to home in on areas where there may be research gaps that require further attention. So for example, we can see that while overall there may not be a yield sacrifice, in these instances outlined in orange, there are cases where legume intercrops underperformed. So maybe now we can look at these instances and see if there may be similarities in these cases, such as the study location or the legume crop species that was used, and find ways that we can improve legume intercropping systems. And I want to end just by highlighting 2 key takeaways that I presented earlier. One is the importance of producing scientific knowledge in a machine-actionable format from the outset. So for example, once data is presented in a figure, it becomes more difficult to precisely extract that quantitative data in a way that could be incorporated into the ORKG. And secondly, as a researcher working in the ORKG, I find it to be a really powerful tool because I'm able to see these overall trends across studies and identify areas that may require further exploration in terms of research and future studies. So with that, I want to say thank you again to ORKG for this wonderful curation grant opportunity. I really learned a lot and I enjoyed so much working with a really welcoming and pioneering group of people. I'm also very appreciative of my fellow science curation grantees. I learned a lot from our discussions and the questions that everybody asked. And thank you all for joining the presentation, and I'd be super happy to answer any questions that you may have.